and welcome to episode 2 of my podcast series, Interviews with Educators. My returning guest is Miss Megan Vosk. Megan is an international educator who has taught and lived in multiple countries and is currently in Vientiane, Laos, working in the middle years program. And she has also served in coordination roles, including one that's very focused on language acquisition. Ms. Megan cares deeply about multilingual learners and about supporting the school with language policies that actively continue to work for those learners across their academic journey. And hello, if you're new, I'm Christina Kottman. I'm an elementary educator who taught for international schools for 10 years in Saudi Arabia, India, and Brazil. And Ms. Megan and I actually worked together in India for a while. And I'm now focused as a consultant on helping school leaders improve their communications, whether that is their feedback processes or their onboarding, or how to embed well-being into their school. One idea that Ms. Megan and I really share is a love of languages. And in this conversation, we're talking about how language shapes learning in schools, and vice versa. How do the policies about language in a school affect student learning? So let's jump into our wonderful conversation with Miss Megan. Welcome back, Megan Vosk. It's so nice to have you again. And this episode has been on my mind because I am so interested in what you've seen with multilingual learners in international schools and in your own experience. And I think from my experience as a classroom teacher, I often had that feeling that when a student was not participating, it wasn't really about their ability, it was mostly about the classroom setup. And I saw that a lot when we were in school-wide events or we were visiting a different classroom and my students were kind of standing off to the side, big eyes and scared faces, wondering, can I be myself here? Can I participate here? And is there going to be an expectation that I utilize English as the only language in this learning space? So what have you seen with multilingual learners across your educational journey?
Yeah, thanks, Christina. It's nice to be talking to you again. So I've been teaching English language acquisition for the past, 10 years. So I usually work with students that are either totally newcomers to English or about to exit the EAL program and go into mainstream environment. And I think a lot of times the general pace of the classroom is just really fast and we're always in a hurry to get through content and things like that. And so a lot of students get left behind or marginalized because they just, as English language learners, they need more time to process and they just can't kind of keep up with the pace in the classroom. So that's why so many students are, I think, very quiet and they can't express themselves or they feel too shy to express themselves because they just don't have time to formulate the thoughts.
Yeah. And I think it's also the structure of the learning environment. If we're mainly providing information visually, auditory options are not available to process what the slides have been saying or what different peers are saying. There can be this feeling of I can't keep up. And of course, when your amygdala kicks in and you're in that fight, flight, freeze, you're not able to continue learning. So I think the structure of the classroom and particularly how instructors and facilitators present knowledge can be really supportive or not so supportive.
Yeah, the traditional teacher calls on a student and then the student responds in front of the whole class like that. And just, a student's not going to feel safe, I don't think, for a long time if they're learning a new language. And you often will hear the student respond either they don't respond at all or they respond in a teeny, tiny whisper. And then the teacher says, speak up, speak louder. And of course that makes the student feel worse. And the student already is totally nervous and worried. And I think kids worry a lot about their pronunciation, their accent, their grammar, if they're going to mix up a word. And so there's just a lot of fear. And I think a feeling of not feeling safe. And when the teacher asks a question like that, they want an immediate response, and the student just is not going to be able to produce that, I think, for a long time. So they kind of freeze up.
Yeah, you're reminding me of experiences I've had both learning Portuguese and working with Portuguese speakers here in Brazil. And there's definitely a cultural difference in how someone presents that they don't understand something. So I had many learners who would just shout, "Miss, I don't understand," even in Portuguese. But it was one of those things where it's it is my responsibility as the educator to figure out structures and supports to guide them. But often that gets passed on to the EAL teacher or the learning support communicators, right? And sometimes teachers, classroom teachers particularly, are left like wondering, is it me? Is it the training? What is this? So what have you experienced with that?
Yeah, and sometimes I think the tendency is to maybe not blame the student, but put more of the responsibility, like, oh, like the student should get it, or the student's been learning for this long, or why doesn't the student just want to? But I think it's like we talked about in the plant episode, like we're just always in such a rush. So sometimes the teacher has a lot to prep and a lot to plan, and like it's hard to really think about like what are the needs of the student at phase 1 English level, or what are the needs of the student at phase 2 English level, especially as an EAL specialist. Do true co-planning, co-teaching, co-reflecting. It requires a lot of time and energy. I think sometimes people are just too pressed for time to really do it like the way that it's intended to be or the way that it should be.
What I see is that we overvalue things that require actually less time if we were more efficient, and undervalue communications and connections that students could be having, especially across international settings. We've been lucky enough to work in international schools, you and I think there's an opportunity there to expand some of the cultural understanding of our learners, particularly when they have this sense that English is the best language, you know, whether that's passed down by their families or even reinforced by the school as this is where you're going to learn English.
Yeah, and the reality is that most of the expat teachers are native English speakers, but almost every student in the classroom is probably a non-native English speaker. Even if they are proficient in English, it's probably like maybe their second or their third language, or maybe the students grow up bilingual, or maybe they have one parent who's an English speaker and one parent who speaks a different language. We have our own biases as expat teachers, and we have our, you know, our understanding the instruction is going to be in English, and all the students are going to speak English and read and write and listen and understand it just fine. But actually, all the students come from very different backgrounds, right? And usually we've got Western expat teachers, and then the students are from the home culture or different cultures, and so they have different language profiles.
Exactly. And I think assistant teachers, if we're lucky enough to have them supporting our students, also become, you know, automatic translators and doing a lot of the role of an English as additional language specialists, possibly without having that confidence or competency. And from your article, I was finding a lot of information about how translanguaging is actually more supportive of English immersion and understanding a different, you know, second language. And can you explain to anyone who's unfamiliar, and to me, because I could use a refresher, of what translanguaging looks like and what it really means?
Sure, yeah, and it's kind of a buzzword these days. So I think the most important thing to share is that it's not translating. So translating something is different from translanguaging. And translanguaging means like bringing in the students' full linguistic repertoires into the classroom. So making sure that the students can use their home language to help understand concepts when they're writing, that they have access to books in their home language, or that the readings are in their home language and in English. And for example, that keywords in a reading passage may be translated for students, or that we look for cognates. I have a lot of students in my classes that speak Chinese, Japanese, and Korean. And we often find that words are similar in all three languages. So that also helps us understand sometimes an idea, because we can say, oh, what is it in Chinese? What is it in Japanese? So look, it's so similar, right? So it's kind of interesting. Yeah, and just letting students know that all the languages that they speak are also valuable, which I think like you were alluding to before, sometimes we put more value on English. And I think that the power imbalance is really clear sometimes, that there's this, you know, English is up here and then the other languages maybe don't have as much equality. But in translanguaging, we really try to make it a little bit more even, so that the students feel proud of who they are and where they come from and their home language and their home culture. I think all of these things are elements of translanguaging. And of course, also families feel valued and respected, and that communication to families goes home in different languages, or that they have access to translation services if they need it. So I guess translating is a part of it, but it's not the whole thing. There's so much more.
Yeah, and that's how we get to culture, is not just the language that you speak. It's also the body language. It's also the presentation of that expression to someone else and the feedback loop that happens. You brought up an interesting idea that the policies of a school can actually decide how the students and the families feel connected and encouraged to use their home language.
Yeah. And it's interesting because I'm part of the Multilingual Learning Research Center Language Policy Working Group. And we've been looking at different language policies from different schools. And they're all like, they're very aspirational documents, right? This is the ideal state of language learning. And lots of schools are working to revise their language policies as we learn more about translanguaging and language equity and what international education could be in terms of like respecting all the different languages that the students bring in and their own cultures. But oftentimes, actually putting the policy into practice is very difficult.
Yeah. I mean, that's part of the work that I'm trying to do with schools is how do we take the aspirations, the conceptual idea that is great on paper, and actually make it functional and even more make it structural so that we don't even have to question this is how things happen because that's the only way they can happen. The pipeline is already designed.
And I'm lucky because actually what I also learned is that many schools don't even have language policies. So like schools that do have language policies are actually ahead of the curve. And some of the language policies that we look at are a little bit more old school. And it's like, oh, like English is the language of instruction or like English is the primary language. But I mean, it's really shifting away from that now. So this language policy working group has made like a template that other schools can use to actually develop their own language policies, which I think is awesome.
Wonderful. I'll have to link that in the description so people can find it. Yeah. I think there's also this fear that teachers have, particularly if you're working with a multilingual population, that I don't speak that language.
Yeah. That's okay though, because actually, is it like 80 or 90% of communication is nonverbal? So, how we position ourselves. Are we nodding? Are we smiling? Do we use thumbs up, thumbs down? Like, does the student feel like we're, welcoming and friendly? So there's so much we can do without even having to say anything. And sometimes it's just learning very small amount. Like, I can't speak Chinese, but I know ni hao. And I know Daijian and I know Xie Xie, which is like hello, goodbye, thank you. So like even just using those, like when the kid enters the classroom and say hello in their language, like that really helps make them feel seen and valued, even if I can't speak any other Chinese.
Exactly. I mean, you're bringing up a practice that I always loved in my morning meetings because I taught first, second, third, fourth grade, right? Elementary kids love learning about other places around the world. And one activity that we would do in our morning meetings was say hello in different languages. So often,
that's really nice.
Often someone would be like, how do you say hello in German again? And someone else across the room is like, Guten Morgen. It was a great opportunity for students, particularly because we had one student from Argentina, one student from Estonia, and one student from Egypt. And no one else really had that context to know their languages. So this was an opportunity for them to say, how do you say good morning or how are you in Estonian? And they got to teach the whole class about their culture a little bit here and there.
Oh, that's really nice. And we do at our school, we have a big celebration for Personal Home Language Day, or like the UN International Mother Tongue Day. And we always do different activities on that day to kind of honor students' different language backgrounds. And I remember one year we did an activity where the students had to write how many different languages they could say hello in collectively as a class without looking it up. I think together my class knew how to say hello in like 40 different languages.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and the idea that there's language crossover, like you mentioned before with Korean and some different languages in Asia, there's opportunities to say, wait, where is the root of this? Because I think that also brings students back to problem solving, making connections, synthesizing information, all these life skills that are sometimes hard to fit in to either our belonging experiences where we're trying to do morning meetings, or even the culture experience of, let's have a school-wide presentation about international life. And it can be a way to say, be curious, but in a practical sense of wondering, where did this come from? Who designed this? Why is it this way?
And then we see more similarities between like different countries than we would before. So students start to say, like, oh, this kid's from a different country, but maybe we have more in common than I thought. And countries that maybe historically have not been the closest of friends, they might start to see kids from that country differently and be able to overcome some biases or assumptions that they have when they see actually elements of their culture are quite similar or elements of their language are similar. They start to see themselves more as allies.
Yeah, and I think they also see themselves as advocates, being able to say, hey, wait, this opportunity, this learning experience or whatever is not having an opportunity for me to share an idea that is from my background. Or in my language, we have a word for this, but we don't have that in English. You know, the example that of course comes to mind because I'm in Brazil is saudade, which is kind of like missing someone, but it's deeper. It's like a longing to have nostalgia and a moment together again, but there's no translation. And a lot of foreigners who come to Brazil love that word because we don't have that meaning.
Yeah, sometimes I often have the translate open when I'm doing reading with students. And if we come to a word that the kids don't know, I'll play the word in Chinese and the AI voice will say the word. And then I'll play it in Japanese and the AI voice will say the word. And sometimes the kids just like start hysterical laughing. And I'm like, is it bad? They're like, it's not. Like you put in something like a literal phrase, but the way it's translated now, it doesn't work, or like that just doesn't make sense.
Exactly.
But I'll often too, after the AI says it, then I'll try to say it. So the kids will laugh even more if it's really not a good translation. They're like, no, Miss May.
I know, I do that too. I'm like, I need to learn this language as well. Like, I want to continue being a lifelong learner, and the best way I can do that is model for learners in my classroom that we're constantly exposed to new information, and we can't expect ourselves to know every language, every culture in the whole world. But we can expect ourselves to approach it with that curiosity and that openness to try. It's the growth mindset stuff.
To ask kids what they say for let's go or good luck, because those are like phrases that I can remember and use, and they also kind of use specific to culture. Same like when you're saying cheers or bon appetit, to find out what the culture says for that is kind of interesting and maybe unique to every country or every language.
Exactly. And I think in schools, like you said, we really focus on they need to know this. There's a pressure to move through the WIDA language model levels. There's a pressure to succeed on exams that are going to be in English. Their university is going to be English speaking. I think when we pull back that fear and anxiety, there is a layer of creativity and awareness that it's just fun to learn other languages. It's fun to speak with people who don't have the same language background as us.
Yeah, you're right. And we do put a lot of pressure on students, especially as they get older. Like, oh, your English needs to be better to do DP classes, or your English isn't good enough for university, or parents and teachers start putting a lot of pressure on older learners. And, you know, the more tense we are, the harder it is to be able to learn the language. So if we can try to relax a little bit more and celebrate all that the student has learned and how amazing it is that someone can, you know, converse in 2 or 3 different languages, I think we'd all be a lot better off, rather than be like, you have to have the academic vocabulary now. I mean, you do also have to learn that, but it's much harder to learn it when you're feeling kind of very tight or like I have to progress quicker. But it takes so long to learn a language, especially languages that are far away linguistically. It takes a long time. I always say to the students, there's no way I could take this test in Chinese. So it's amazing that you can take this test in English. Like, it's incredible.
Yeah. And I think it's also praising their consistent progress, right? They're going after this goal of becoming conversational, being able to use it in academic spaces, to be able to share ideas with one colleague speaking this language and then turn around and speak to another colleague. I think that's also where we're going with global communication, because we now have access like this, right? I'm in Brazil, you're in Laos, we're talking on the camera, having this amazing podcast. And more often, I think students are going to have opportunities to cross that language barrier. So when school doesn't give them that space, we're kind of setting them up for a future that they're not going to experience.
Yeah, and as they cross the language barrier, it was making me think like they also become bicultural and start learning more about the English speaking world and the English culture. So it's not just the language that they're learning, but also cultural norms, practices, ways of being. Like even the way that school looks in the English speaking environment might be different than how school looks in China or Korea. And so the students are also learning a whole new culture. Just a huge to be able to navigate 2 cultures like that. It's an amazing skill set for students to have. And that's the translanguaging too, right? This idea of trans means like you can go across and go between and kind of move through. You're not stuck on one side or the other, but you think about what best suits the context and the need, and you can kind of go fluidly from between. It's just kind of amazing.
I think there's also an awareness that we need to have with the English speaking world that English culture is also very different, whether it's in the US, Australia, New Zealand, South Africa. Like, you're going to have a different experience of that language based on the culture that you are most associated with. Even when we were working in India, the people around us were speaking English and utilizing English phrases, but still it was within that culture. And of course, there's the colonial histories, but I think it's important to recognize it's not a culture in itself, even when we speak English in schools.
Yeah, and there's so many different accents and variations of English. And I think also sometimes we tend to put more value on people who speak English with a certain accent, which is also kind of gets at power and privilege and equity, and trying to realize that we all use different accents that reflect who we are and where we come from. Like I've also had students try to speak English with different kinds of accents. So they try to use more of like the high accent or like something that sounds a little bit more formal. And so saying, no, like you can be yourself, or if you do feel like you have to code switch, really think about why, and to really trying to get the students to think more deeply about how different language like conveys power and privilege, and making that visible to students so they understand it.
Yeah, and I think visible to the community and especially school leaders as well, because as we craft language policies, there should be an awareness built in that we are not saying that this one language is better. It is more useful for students in certain contexts to use this language. Also, the way that we bring people into our community, especially if we're hiring for language support services, making sure that there is this understanding that we're not training you to become an English speaker so that you can excel in school. There's also a value to the local language or the mother tongue that they're utilizing, and also that the professional educator is bringing this wealth of knowledge that's not just because you're a Portuguese speaker, we hired you for this role. There's actually a lot of training that goes into becoming able to train students and work with them in language.
Yeah, and we talked in the episode about the plant medicine, about the indigenous culture and valuing traditional ways of knowledge. And I think it's also important to value traditional languages. And it would be a shame if everyone just spoke English and all of the, other languages disappeared, even though that is what's happening. Like when we look at maps of vanishing languages and we see that these small languages are disappearing. Pasalao, for example, that they speak here is such a small language group that there's hardly any media or anything produced. Like most of the content that people consume here is in Thai. So thinking about how to preserve a small language like Lao is really important, I think.
It definitely is. And it kind of reminds me of how we have so many different food choices in the world, right? If you were only going to eat one food for the rest of your life, it's like only speaking one language.
Yeah, and your language is like who you are, like it's very integral to people's sense of self and identity, and especially when students are learning a new language, we don't want to deny them their home language, their home culture, their identity. We want students to feel empowered and safe. We don't want to deny them like parts of who they are.
Exactly. I think that's also an area of caution when we're creating school events and community opportunities, right? We don't want to say, on this one day, we value your home culture. On this one day, we can speak all the languages. It needs to be across the board that, we're celebrating this moment in time across our school community, but that doesn't mean that's the only time when we value Brazilian culture, for example.
Yeah, that's really important, right? Like many schools have like one World Day or International Day, but like that shouldn't just be it shouldn't just be one day, right? It should be embedded throughout the curriculum and throughout students' school experiences.
It's kind of like having one Earth Day. It's the only day we care about the Earth.
Yeah, exactly. We don't want it to be like that, right?
Yeah, and that takes us nicely into talking about the community involvement, particularly moving from service learning to more of long-term community partnerships, which is what we're going to talk about in the next episode. So before we jump over there, is there anything you'd like to leave the audience with in terms of language? Maybe a book recommendation or another podcast that they can go listen to really hone this idea that language is not a singular thing.
Yeah, I love the Empowering MLs podcast by Tan Nguyen. He works at ISPP in Cambodia, and he's also written a book about supporting multilingual learners. And I think he's working on his second book. And he's like my hero. Like his work is amazing, and he's done so much to advocate for multilingual learners and to provide examples of like concrete teaching strategies that you can use to boost students' language skills and help them feel confident in the classroom.
Wonderful. I'll definitely link that below for anyone who's listening. And thank you for joining us. And we can probably say thank you in some different languages to close out this episode.
Okay.
I know, I'm like now blanking. Like, how do I say thank you in different languages? Well, danke.
In Lao you say kopjade.
Very nice. And in Brazilian Portuguese, you would say obrigada. So thank you so much for joining us. We'll see you in episode 3.
Gracias.